Welcome to the OutSystems JavaScript and jQuery masterclass. In this masterclass, we'll be covering web and mobile screen lifecycles. For the web, we'll be talking about where to add JavaScript, extended properties and jQuery, Silk UI, integrating a jQuery plugin, and debugging JavaScript. These are all demos for web applications. For mobile, we'll be talking about where to add JavaScript, some advanced JavaScript usages, and debugging JavaScript. These are all demos for mobile applications. Web and mobile screen lifecycles, or what happens when you browse the web. Now, the typical way HTTP operates is by using what is called a request-response pattern. A user clicks on a link or types a URL on the browser. Now, what a browser does is to send a request for a resource to the server. We can see the request here. The server receives a request for that resource and then sends an appropriate response with the resource back to the browser. Typically, this first response is HTML, which may include references to other files, such as images, CSS, JavaScript, and so on. And if it does, the browser repeats this process. It sends further requests for more files, for instance, an image file, and gets back, in this instance, from the server, an image. So with the information that it receives on each response, the browser renders that response on the screen as it fits the current application and therefore presenting the resource to the user. Now, there are two possible types of response. Static resources, such as CSS, JavaScript, or images. They're called static because they don't require server computation. These are then received by the browser and therefore interpreted or run by the browser. So if it's an image, it will be decoded because it's typically compressed. PNG images are compressed in a specific algorithm, JPEG images in a different algorithm, and so on. So the browsers need to implement decoders for different types of images to be able to display them on screen. JavaScript and CSS are character-based, letter-based files that have their own specific syntax, and the browser needs to interpret these files and run them to perform the appropriate actions, which is to apply style in case of CSS or to execute some code in the case of JavaScript. Now, different screens can load different resources, such as JavaScript, as per their needs. Now, another type of response is dynamic content, typically HTML. This means that when the server receives such request, it will execute some logic and gather data maybe to build a response. And the response is built in HTML. This is sent to the browser, and the browser interprets this HTML. Typically, this HTML is the first response, and it includes references to these static resources. All screen resources are reloaded from the network or from the browser's local cache on every request or on every new page. So if the user browses from a screen to the next by clicking on a link, then the browser receives a new dynamic content, HTML. It receives then some static resources which are reloaded either from the network or from the local cache, again, for this new screen. Now, this is the typical operation for a web application, whereby it simply acts as a request-response cycle, and each screen is therefore independent. Now, when we're moving on to mobile apps, the scenario is slightly different, and it uses a more modern web application development pattern, which is called the single page application, or SPA. whereby all the resources for your application are loaded onto your local device, in this case an iPad or a tablet in general, and it is JavaScript, it is logic on this device that decides what to display on screen. If the device needs more data from the server, then it uses fast REST calls to the server to retrieve that data. And it can be data that's directly from an entity, or that's computed by an action or a processing. And therefore the server itself no longer concerns itself with generating HTML, with generating layout. Now the server is simply a data provider, a central source of truth for the data, and your application resides almost entirely on the device. It's loaded once when the application starts. Everything is now loaded on a single page on the browser, on the built-in browser, which is called the web view in the Cordova shell. And JavaScript ensures that only the relevant widgets are displayed for the screen that you're trying to display at this moment. So JavaScript moves elements in and out of the visible DOM as necessary during your navigation of the application. This is a much faster experience than the typical scenario, and it's the best experience for mobile devices. And this is the type of application that OutSystems generates for mobile devices. Now, in this scenario, the server responds with only a single possible type of response, which is dynamic data. It's typically data encoded in a JSON format, which is required or typically used for REST web service calls. So this data is handled by JavaScript code in the browser. And now, using this kind of pattern, single page application, SPA, different screens can use different resources, such as that JavaScript, but they often do not load different resources, because resources for all screens are loaded when the application starts. And it is JavaScript code, in this case the React framework, that switches screens and applies data dynamically. This means there's a major difference in the way web applications are built and mobile applications are built. And we're going to see in the next two videos demos for those two separate ways of building applications. So to sum up the differences, web apps and mobile apps. Web apps run logic on the server, whereas mobile apps run logic on the device, right here. Web apps store data on the server. Mobile apps store data locally and on the server. Web apps fetch data synchronously, as needed for each screen. Mobile apps fetch data asynchronously, so a screen is displayed instantly while the call to the server is triggered. And the user can already see some elements on the screen, even though they're empty and void of any data. And as soon as the response comes back from the server, data fills in the relevant widgets and fills in the screen that the user is watching, is seeing. Web apps therefore use a direct request-response pattern, whereas mobile apps react to changes immediately. They use the single-page application, SPA pattern. Let's take a look at the demos.